If you've ever read or watched the Harry Potter series, you might have noticed they use some funny words when casting a spell, like Accio or Expecto Patronum. If you were curious, you might have looked up some of these phrases and realized that a lot of these words are Latin. Accio means I summon, and Expecto Patronum means I look for a protector. From this, you might get the mistaken impression that Latin is magic. As someone who has studied Latin for over a decade, I can assure you that simply speaking Latin and waving around a stick does not make any magic happen. Believe me, I've tried. Though maybe I just need to work on my flick and swish. However, the idea that Latin is magic is very old indeed. It stems from a time when most important business, whether it be writing a law or getting to heaven, was conducted in Latin. At the same time, the vast majority of common people did not understand Latin at all. We call this time the Dark Ages. The persistence of Latin into the Dark Ages might seem strange to us. After all, the Dark Ages occurred after the collapse of the Roman Empire. So, why was anyone still speaking Latin? Well, for starters, the Roman Catholic Church had been tightly bound to the Roman Empire ever since the conversion of the Roman Emperor Constantine, around 312 CE. When the Roman Empire collapsed, the Church stepped in and assumed many of the trappings of the empire. They usurped the imperial seat of Rome. They borrowed Roman vestments and symbols of authority. They copied the Roman hierarchy and bureaucracy. Considering all the distinctly Roman things that the Church held on to, it is not surprising that they held on to Latin as well, even after the rest of Europe had stopped speaking it. All church business, from decrees by the Pope in the Vatican to Mass at the humblest parish, was conducted in Latin. Yet the Church did not simply hold on to Latin out of habit. There were several other good reasons to keep using Latin. First of all, Latin was the international language of the time. Though commoners could not read Latin, the elite could. Latin allowed educated people to communicate across borders and language boundaries. Second, Latin lends authority. It does this in two ways. One, by being incredibly old, and two, by sounding awesome. Don't believe me? Tell me, which sounds cooler? In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Or, in nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti. Now you may doubt that this idea influenced the choices of the Church. But just imagine you're the head of a religion. As such, your authority lies not in strength of arms, but in people's imaginations. You hold authority only so long as people believe you hold authority. So what can you do to maintain this authority? You might deck yourself out in grand vestments, or build grand buildings with impressive works of art. But even after that, you're just a bunch of people in silly hats standing around in a fancy building. To hide this fact, you need to add some mystery. What better way to mystify the day-to-day rituals of reciting prayers and eating crackers and drinking wine than to conduct the whole affair in an ancient, awesome-sounding language? Latin made even the most mundane prayer mystical, momentous, and magical. Yet perhaps the most compelling reason the Church held on to Latin was that the common people could not read Latin. Now, this might seem like a reason not to use Latin, but think of it this way. People only showed the Church such reverence because they thought the Church held the keys to heaven. If people began to think that they could get to heaven on their own, they would not need the Church, and the Church would lose its power. What better way to maintain a stranglehold on salvation than to make the path to salvation accessible only through a language that only you speak? By establishing a language barrier to heaven, the Church ensured that anyone trying to get to heaven would have to come through them. Thus we've seen why the Church held on to Latin for so long. It was an international language, it lent the Church authority, and it kept the common people dependent on the Church for salvation. These factors alone would have been enough to keep the Church using Latin. Yet over the years, some church leaders began to realize that this language barrier provided an opportunity. If only priests could read the Bible, then the church wasn't necessarily obligated to follow the Bible's teachings. After all, if they changed a thing or two, who would know? And even if someone caught them red-handed, who would dare call down the Roman Catholic Church? Yet in 1517, someone did just that. His name was Martin Luther. He was a German priest and theologian, and he was mad as hell. What got Luther so upset was the church's practice of selling indulgences. An indulgence is a remission of the penalties of sin. Basically, you could sin your face off, but if you had an indulgence, you could still go to heaven. The idea was that the church had some leftover forgiveness lying around, and it would part with that forgiveness for a sum of money. One could even buy an indulgence for the deceased. The indulgence became, essentially, a ticket out of purgatory. From the church's perspective, they were simply making forgiveness more accessible and allowing the living to help out the dead. From Luther's perspective, the church was engaged in extortion. It was amassing wealth by holding people's souls and the souls of their loved ones hostage. As an ordained priest and theologian, Luther could read the Latin Bible and its Greek counterpart. But no matter how hard he looked, he could not find anything in the Bible that granted the church this power. Nor did he think it right that the church should be making money off of the business of salvation. Luther wanted these abuses to stop. So, in 1517, he wrote his 95 Theses, in which he called down the Pope himself for selling phony get-out-of-purgatory free passes and amassing wealth in exchange for forgiveness of sins. If Luther had stopped there with writing his complaint, he probably would never have accomplished much. He would have just been an obscure monk from a backwater part of Europe, challenging the authority of the Pope, God's representative on earth. But Luther did not stop with just telling people what was and what wasn't in the Bible. After all, that's what the church was doing, and they had a lot more practice and authority. Instead, Luther translated the original Greek Bible into the Vernacular, or the native language of his people, in this case, German. Thanks to the recent advances in printing made possible by Gutenberg, Luther was able to publish his translated Bible cheaply in 1522, making it available to the common man. Luther's Bible was not the first vernacular Bible to be published, but it was certainly the most popular. In the words of Johann Colchäus, a contemporary of Luther's, Luther's New Testament was so much multiplied and spread by printers that even tailors and shoemakers, yea, even women and ignorant persons who had accepted this new Lutheran gospel and could read a little German, studied it with the greatest avidity, as the fountain of all truth. Some committed it to memory, and carried it about in their bosom. In a few months, such people deemed themselves so learned that they were not ashamed to dispute faith and the gospel, not only with Catholic laymen, but even with priests and monks and doctors of divinity. With the mass distribution of vernacular Bibles, Luther didn't need to tell people what the Bible said. They could read it and find out for themselves. The result was nothing short of earth-shattering. Before the spread of the vernacular Bible, if people wanted to know the will of God, they would have to ask a priest. Once people had a vernacular Bible at their disposal, they could read it for themselves and determine what God wanted without the church's intervention. Suddenly, for more and more people, the church was no longer the only way to access heaven. Instead, the church was an obstruction, a middleman trying to make money off of people's quest for salvation. This protest of the Roman Catholic Church quickly gained the name Protestant and spread across Christendom. The publication of a Dutch Bible in 1526 soon led to the creation of the Dutch Reformed Church in 1560. The translation of a French Bible in 1530 also quickly gave rise to an uprising of French Protestants, or Huguenots. The Protestant Reformation had no single leader, no shared tenets. The only thing that these scattered Protestant reforms had in common was that they were all accompanied by a mass publishing of a vernacular Bible. Recognizing this threat, the Church did everything in its power to stop the printing of Bibles, or anything else for that matter. Several popes even went so far as to condemn the printing press as a tool of Satan. Yet the damage was done, and people who had already begun to question the authority of the Church were unlikely to listen to the condemnations of the Pope. This fact was not lost on Europe's monarchs. Many leaders had grown tired of the Church's heavy-handed control from its seat in faraway Rome. The foremost of these was King Henry VIII of England. Henry had his own problems with the Church, though they were more political than theological. Nevertheless, he had a vested interest in undermining the authority of the Church. So, Henry took a page from Luther's book, as it were. He broke off from the Catholic Church, and in 1538 he commissioned the creation of an English translation of the Bible, known as the Great Bible. With his separation from the Church and the publishing of the Great Bible, Henry VIII established an English tradition of angering Rome. Indeed, pissing off the Pope became something of a national pastime. This tradition reached its apex in 1604, when King James I of England commissioned the publication of the King James Bible, which would remain the standard English translation of the Bible for the next 4 centuries. To summarize, for hundreds of years, the Roman Catholic Church had used Latin to maintain its mystery and authority. The Church did not want people reading the Bible, and it certainly didn't want people asking inconvenient questions like, "Where does it say that in the Bible?" So long as no one but priests could read the Bible, no one could question what the Church did or said. Around the turn of the 16th century, people began publishing translations of the Bible in the vernacular, or the native language of their readers. The most famous of these vernacular translations were Luther's German Bible, published in 1522, Henry VIII's Great Bible, published in 1538, and the King James Bible, published in 1604. With the vernacular Bible at their disposal, people no longer needed the Church to go to heaven. Every man was his own theologian, and the Church could no longer count on people's ignorance to guarantee their compliance. The rise of the vernacular, combined with the invention of the printing press, brought about the Protestant Reformation, which swept across Europe, undermining the power of the Church at every step. This did not mean that Latin was gone forever. Latin would continue to be used